Good morning, Daniel.
Nope, I'm making up for being out volunteering last week.
One day we'll get a consistent tempo, maybe?
We have to keep you guessing. It keeps things interesting.
Only if you say so. So, what are we talking about this week?
Thinking deeper about travel as a financial planner, how to plan for your parents' care as they age, and helping your kids get a head start in life.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, travel, old people, young people. It's a whole panoply of fun things.
No, they actually tie together this time, which is abnormal for my topics. But these are always questions. We meet with people in the initial stages, and they often have very vague goals. It's hard to answer, what do you want out of life 50 years from now? That is a tough question. And these are kind of the big three things that people are like, I don't know. Maybe I should think about these things. But they often have trouble getting specific, which is why I picked them.
Sure, it's funny. I feel like if the answer was like if the question was what do you want to do 50 years from now, I feel like for about half our clients the answer would be like be alive. That would be nice.
That's true.
It's a little far out.
Maybe less than 50 for the older ones. But I find that the younger people are, who I love working with, it is hard to plan that far out.
Well, sure. I mean, right. If you've only lived 25 or 30 or 35 years, the idea of what you're going to be doing in 50 years seems pretty abstract.
Yeah, that's a very tough question. So hopefully today we can kind of talk about what we recommend people start thinking about as they try to narrow down their goals with topics like travel.
Okay. Well, I mean, what I guess is the discussion here? What in the genre of travel do we want to talk about?
All right. I very much so want to cover like what kind of things do people need to consider as they're trying to narrow down their goals? Even really simple things that we've touched on a little bit in other podcasts, but not in depth enough. There's a temptation, to put it on your credit card. I'm young, it's fine. Even something as simple as like, how do I finance my travel?
Sure. I mean, first things first, before you even get into like how are you going to pay for it or how's it going to work, I think you have to decide whether travel is going to be a part of your work life, whether travel is going to be an incremental, periodic thing, like the annual trip, the biannual trip, something like that. And from that, sort of inform how you want to go about it. Because I think there's a big difference between like travel as a passive activity and part of your life versus travel as a like a thing you kind of step away from your life to go do. So, in the framework of like a working travel, right? Whether it's your job that actually has you traveling and then you don't really have a say over it, but maybe you've got a job where you work in logistics or consulting or certain types of science and tech, where sometimes you just got to go to other countries or other parts of your country to do it. I think that's a one where maybe it's not travel in the way you'd think of it for fun, but I think you make time for it. Even something like for us as financial planners, we don't have a lot of reasons to travel for business other than conferences or education, but conferences are often held in interesting places, and so carving out time on either side can make sense. Now, if it's periodic travel, that's where I think things like credit card strategies, financing, duration of travel, et cetera, starts to play a much bigger role and is more of a planning conversation.
Sure. And there's so much to think about. I think there's hidden costs to travel. People like, I have 2 weeks of PTO, so it's fine. It's not a money thing, but you're leaving, you're not taking care of your personal life because you're not there. Things are piling up. Do people need to account for things like that, or that's too minuscule to even factor in?
I think it depends on the nature of like the causality of the pileup, right? So like I'll use our business as an example. From a revenue standpoint, part of the reason that we have kind of unlimited sick leave, unlimited PTO, a sabbatical program, et cetera, is essentially all the business that we do here is recurring. We have these long-term relationships with clients where they are going to pay us on an ongoing basis. And so that gives us a lot of planning flexibility around something like having somebody be out of the office. But if you work in a field where there's sort of like physical, tangible deliverables, where everything you do is sort of incremental, and like everything you do is project oriented, where everything's going to be a 6, 9, 12 month cycle, and you've got to have 17 steps of projects that require multiple team members and organizations and buy-in and review and all of that, then it's harder for you to take these longer steps away or have that much flexibility, because your absence may literally cause something to just get stuck, or for deadlines to be missed, or for deliverables not to happen on time. So in that context, I think it really depends on the nature of your work, and in the sense then that your stuff piles up in your personal life or your work life, it has to sort of be a reflection of that. I think there's a good example out there of something like the van life. You see more and more people, buying a Sprinter van and renovating it or something like that, and just traveling around and living in it for a while. And I think the way you mitigate things like your personal life piling up there is you sort of do a clear out on your personal things, right? You don't have a house at that time. You don't have an apartment at that time. You have your mail forwarded to a scanning service that will just open everything and scan it for you, so you have it, in case something comes up. And you really just try to sort of declutter your life to make that work. But if it's something like, I want to take a 2-month trip to Southeast Asia, I want to go to 10 different countries and so on, and I'm mid-career and I've got a family and kids and all of that, that's harder to do. I think to get to your core question here, how important is it for you to deal with that or plan with that? It's just a question of how impactful that potential clutter and kind of piling up is.
Right. And it depends on your time in life and whether or not you can do that. That tracks. As they're planning for things, you kind of mentioned things like credit card points and stuff. Is that something that should be a big factor as well, or just be smart, use them while you can, but don't necessarily center around it?
I sort of lean on the latter, but I could also talk about why the former makes some degree of sense. Like, I'm actually a good case study for the former. I think the latter makes sense insofar as you have to remember that points and rewards and miles and all this are designed to entice you to consume in a particular manner, or to consume certain products or services from specific vendors, and that there's no free lunch. Right now, credit card points, whether it's cash back or miles, are technically treated as a rebate of money you spent. And there's the thing where maybe your credit card gives you 5x miles if you go to restaurants, but it's only 1x for gas or regular stores. Like, there's little things like that can sort of be ticky tacky. But remember that essentially you're just spending a fraction of your income. I think it's very smart to use credit cards responsibly to get cash back or miles or rewards or something. But I'd be careful about falling into the trap that all the companies offering these want you to fall into, which is the overconsumption trap, where you're spending money to rack up points, but you have to remember that the points are never going to amount to more than like 2 or 3% of your consumption. And so if I'm spending $1 to quote unquote make 2 cents or 3 cents in rewards, that's not really a good way to go about it. But I think if you just happen to have a regular life and you don't really think about the rewards as a driver of your behavior, but you're like, hey, I'll take 1 or 2 cents back on every transaction, or I'll take free flights every couple of years, based on my normal spending behavior, I think that's okay. Now, if you're me, right, I'm the type of person who likes to use miles, because if I use cash back, I wouldn't do anything with it. So I prefer miles as my form of reward and credit card consumption, because I can only really use it for that purpose. And so that sort of becomes the reason for me to have that particular type of card versus cash back or some other type of rewards card.
And is that because if you said you get the cash back, you wouldn't use it for travel, and you're trying to encourage yourself to do that?
Pretty much. I already save an enormous amount of my income as it is. Like, I could afford to travel a lot more than I already do, or have a lot higher quality travel than I otherwise would spending cash. But if I have 1 million miles on United, well, gee, that's 2 first-class tickets from here to Vietnam, or from here to the UK, or from here to Italy or something, with my wife. And that's all we can really use it for in a serious sense. Or we could fly first class domestically a bunch, but that's not so expensive that I wouldn't just pay cash for it anyway. So it sort of forces a quality of life factor, rather than having cash back and be like, cool, I'll just transfer that to my savings, and now I have more money on my savings that I'm not spending on anything anyway.
Okay, that makes sense for you, and based on what I know of you. As we're talking to people about travel, that's another big topic then, is the quality of travel. How do they decide between like a bunch of really cheap trips or like long weekends versus doing some big fancy luxury all-inclusive type vacation?
I think this is really just a sliding scale between like quantity and duration versus quality. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer for anybody. I think there's a balance that anybody can strike for themselves in deciding, hey, I think this is the right type of travel for me and my lifestyle and my needs. I think health can be a factor, family size can be a factor, right? Like a married couple making $300,000 a year might decide to go on a kind of bougier trip, but a married couple making $300,000 a year with four kids is probably going to go for lower cost, higher quantity, quote unquote, insofar as like, hey, let's do more trips to national parks. Let's take more trips to visit our parents, across the state or on the other side of the country, where we're not going to fly first class. We're not going to stay in 4 or 5 star hotels and resorts. We're going to go do more stuff because we're trying to kind of get more experiences in for our family. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I think you decide on the type and quality of travel that you want. I think the only exception to this is when you are on one end of an economic spectrum, right? You have a lot of savings, a lot of wealth, a lot of income, but you're still kind of penny pinching for your travel in ways or places that just don't make sense for you. We had a conversation with a client yesterday who has a net worth of around $5 million, and we were talking to him about his travel budget and his wife's travel budget and retirement. And one of our points of advice was like, you could just fly first class. Like, you don't have to; it's not necessary, but you're already underspending so much relative to your wealth accumulation because you have high Social Security income, you have high pension income, and so on, that frankly you could afford to do it, and you'd probably enjoy your first day or two on your trip a lot more if you were kind of well rested and comfortable going to and coming back from. And I don't think you quite took the advice. I think his response to that was like, well, don't tell my wife that. But that's just sort of the general advice. It was like, look, man, like, you can afford it. If you want to, go for it. If you don't want to, that's your decision. But I'm telling you, as your planner, you'll be fine if you enjoy your life and enjoy a slightly higher quality if you want.
Yeah. And he's in that place in life where it makes sense for him too. I think I tend to go the more frugal route, but I'm young, I'm not married, I don't have kids traveling with me, it doesn't matter. So like for me, I do it totally differently.
Well, like, and kids again is sort of a good example. Like today, I tend to fly first class just because, in a literal sense, I don't really like rubbing elbows with people. Like, just as on a physical level, I'm kind of over it. But the day that Caitlin and I have a child or something, we'll probably just go back to flying economy or economy plus because we can stick small child in between us, and then I'm not going to have to rub elbows with anybody. I'm just going to have to make sure I don't like elbow Junior in the face accidentally.
Right. Changes things. Okay. How do you categorize in your brain other types of travel? Like you're not choosing it. Your friend is having a destination wedding and you got to pay for it. Is that still in your mental travel budget or do you make some sort of other category when you're thinking about things like that?
I like to put that into a different category, particularly for young people. I think as you get older, it's probably less material because you've built up a certain level of income and wealth and it happens less frequently. But particularly for like the post college 22 to 28-year old sort of time frame, there's this weird phase, and if you're older, you know exactly what this is, and if you're younger, you might be experiencing this now. But there is this weird time frame where like 90% of your friends get married. You might be one of the friends who gets married too, and it seems like everybody wants an Instagram wedding to some extent. So like the weddings just are not happening at like the local church or the local community center or something. They're always happening up in the mountains or in a different state, or maybe they're dating somebody who's from a different place than you are, so then they've had to go somewhere else, or that's part of their job when they graduated, they moved across the country, but you're getting invited. Like I went through a year where I was in 9 weddings. I was best man, I think 6 or 7 of them, and I spent way too much money on like tuxedos and bachelor party stuff and flights and all of that. Super, super fun. But I think it's reasonable for people at a particular stage of life to just say like, look, I've got a wedding, travel, whatever budget. And maybe my travel and my wedding budget are two separate things. But like my wedding budget is $2,000 a year. And so I will say yes to the first wedding this year, and I will say maybe to the second wedding, and I will say no to the third wedding. Depending on what kind of the cost investment is. And I think it's reasonable to tell your friends like, hey, I'm friends with 19 people our age, and I know like half of you are getting married in the next 2 years. So I would love to go to and attend all of them. But I'll be perfectly honest, if you're getting married in Maui and then somebody else is getting married in like Quebec, I'm not going to make both of those. I can't sacrifice my financial well-being for that. So, I'm giving fair warning to everybody. I'd love to be involved. I'd love to be at your weddings, etc. But I'm just going to give you, fair warning in advance. If you spring your wedding on me in 2 weeks, like, hey, we're just eloping, but we're going to have a party and we're going to go into Vegas. Sorry, it's just not in the budget. Love you. Hope you have a great time. Looking forward to seeing the pictures.
Right. That's tough to say though, especially if it's people you're close to. I know your wedding was kind of a destination wedding. Did it offend you if people didn't come? Was it tough to hear that or not necessarily?
I was only offended insofar as I understood the reality of somebody's reason or rationale for saying yes or no. So I'll give you a good example. We had a couple of friends who came that I was shocked came. I was like, wow, like, we're not super close, but you came and I'm really glad you did. And I'm glad you attended. Like, this was not cheap and giving your income a means. Like, thank you so much. There were other cases. We had one set of friends where we essentially bent over backwards to try to help them get there. Like, we were willing to help them with accommodations. We were willing to help them essentially with everything but the flights. And like the flights to get there, bearing in mind they knew when the wedding was going to be like 18 months in advance, it would have cost them like $400 to come. And they were still like, nope, we just can't do it. And I was like, all right, like, pardon my French, random friend, but kind of fuck you. I know you can, you just don't want to. And this is extra compounded by the fact that like a week after our wedding or something, they were showing off some like expensive stuff they spent money on. I was like, really, like, honestly, go fuck yourselves. So again, I think it's just personal. Some people are just completely indifferent to it. Some people, you will absolutely ruin their perception of you. And this is where, again, I come back to communicating openly well in advance about what you can and can't do, and just letting people know and saying like, look, if your wedding's here in town, I'm there, like 1,000%. Right. But the further you move the pin from where we are, the more bachelorette stuff you require us to do, the more fancy, bespoke, custom crap you require us to do, the less I'm going to be able to do this. And so that's just part of balancing it. And also, as the person getting married, having some deal of respect for the people who may or may not attend based on how much burden you're placing on them. Like, I know for a fact everybody who came to our wedding, and except for the handful of people who were local, probably had to spend something like $1,000 per person. I'm not unaware of that. So when I say that I balanced, hey, I think you could make it, and it makes sense, and I'm kind of upset that you didn't make it, versus, hey, you didn't make it, and I completely understand why. That's part of what you just have to be able to account for there.
Yeah. Or maybe they could come to some parts of it. Like I know I had a friend in South Carolina when I got married, and she did come out for the wedding. She flew out. She got here, like, drove from the airport to the wedding in Estes, like, did her makeup on the plane. She was wearing a dress on the plane, comes to my wedding ceremony, turns around, goes back to the airport, and flies home like in 24 hours because she couldn't get work off. And she was like, I'm so sorry, I'm not coming to any bachelorette stuff or bridal shower or whatever. And I was like, I didn't expect you to. I'm amazed you came to the ceremony at all. Like, that was quite a feat that you made that happen with your work schedule right now. And I don't remember being offended by that at all. I was honored she came, and she was kind of stressed that I'd be mad that she was like 5 minutes late or something. And like, no, it's amazing that you came.
Yeah, and I think that's a very healthy compromise. Is you saying like, hey, it's a stretch for you to come. Her saying like, I'm going to make it happen, and nobody's like upset or mad about the parameters of it. I think the inverse to a lot of this also is some wedding parties sort of make a big mistake around when it comes to travel, being like, we're going to have the bachelor or bachelorette thing like 2 months before the wedding, and it's essentially going to cost just as much as your participation in the wedding. It's like, it was already going to cost you $1,000, $2,000 to travel and get your suit, dress, etc. But also, we're going to do something fun in the Hamptons, or we're going to like Miami or Key West or something. So you've got to do double wedding costs. And again, it just comes back to reasonableness. I think one of the best wedding gifts you can give, or sort of not wedding gifts, but sort of bridesmaid, groomsmen gifts you can give, is just defraying the cost. Right, like my groomsmen gift to my groomsmen was I bought their suits. Like, that was it. I gave them gift certificates or gift cards to the tailors, essentially, and said like, if you have a great suit, great, use this for anything else you want. If you don't have a great suit, here's what I recommend. Here's the gift card that will pay for all of it. Like, and that was and the tailoring and all of it that would go with that. That was my gift, because it's like, hey, I'm not going to make you spend $200-300 on renting a tux, or $300-500 on buying a suit. I'm going to defray that cost for you, so that way it's that much less burdensome for you to attend and take part.
Yeah, that's nice. I think that makes more sense than some gesture that they maybe don't want or will use later. They'd much rather have something practical.
I have gotten a lot of like monogrammed flasks and like travel shaving kits over the years, and I do still have one of them. But I gotta admit, like, I've lost all the flasks and lighters. I think there's a knife somewhere. I definitely have a pint glass that still has my name on it, but that's it. There's a lot of groomsmen, bridesmaid gifts that are just kind of not good.
Yeah, they'll all get lost eventually.
I thought we were talking about travel.
Oh yeah. Okay, we have to circle back. What are your thoughts on travel insurance?
Ooh, yeah, this is sort of like the investment thing. If you can't afford to lose it, don't make the investment. So in the same sense, like if you can't afford to redo the travel, or the travel is like mandatory in a sense where you can live without it, get the travel insurance, right? So like if you're going to spend, $10,000 on this trip overseas, with your partner or with your family, and it's the only trip you're going to take all year because it's the only trip you can afford, I think it's worth spending the $100, $200 to get the travel insurance on that. But if it's like your $220 ticket to Kansas City, I don't think you need to pay $20 to insure it in most cases. So that's just sort of the balance. If you can afford to live with the loss of the trip or not taking a trip, don't bother to insure it. If you can't, then yeah, go ahead and insure that risk because you can't afford to lose it.
Does the timeline affect that all for you? If you're like, oh, I'm planning a trip for 12 months from now, a lot could happen between now and then. Is it a better idea to get insurance then, or you don't care?
It really depends, honestly, on kind of, again, the costs, but also the nature of the thing. Because a lot of travel insurance that's sort of sold at the point of sale is also very, very limited in scope. Like if you buy plane tickets, they'll try to sell you travel insurance, but often that travel insurance really is only going to cover just the flight and maybe like an incidental, like one night at a hotel. And so the question is your travel insurance going to cover the flight, or is it going to cover the accommodations? Is it going to cover the rental car? Is it going to cover the opportunity cost of like the excursion and trips and tours and whatever you were going to pay for on this trip, etc. It's like there's a big difference in the quality of travel insurance and what really applies there. So I think that also becomes the question. Like I think the further out, it might make more sense, but I think I also just return to the, what is the nature of the thing? There's also an element of quality here, right? Like if and again, I'm being bougie and privileged as I say this, right? But if I buy first class tickets overseas, guess what? I don't need travel insurance on that flight because it's baked into the price that they are going to reschedule that for me or something like that. Like for our honeymoon, we had tickets to fly out on Sunday from San Francisco to Auckland, and originally it was on United, and about 4 or 5 months before, United called us and said, "Hey, we've canceled every other day of flights, and your flight happens to be on that every other day, so we can move you up by a day or we can move you back by a day." We were like, neither of those work for us, and they were like, not a problem. We are going to get you a first class flight on Air New Zealand instead. And no cost, no hassle. Here's the number you're going to call. It's already taken care of. Like just call to make sure you pick your seats and all of that. Picked up the phone, made a call. Here's your seat map. Click, done. 10 minutes to fix our $10,000 flights overseas. And so as part of if you pay at a certain quality, it's baked into it. But if you buy the Spirit Airlines, Ryanair, everything including your shoes costs an extra fee sort of airline, yeah, your travel insurance is going to make a lot more sense in that case, particularly if it's a far out flight.
Yeah, I know. I think that my sister and I are going to Slovenia in the fall, and she was very anxious about whether or not to get travel insurance because she's like, it's so far away and it's such a long flight. It's a big point of debate among us.
So did you actually get the travel insurance or not?
We did, and it already kind of paid off because we're flying through Turkish Airlines, and there was already kind of like, hey, we're moving your flight, but that's your problem. And I was like, no, it's not. So it did turn out to be good for us already, and we haven't even gone on the trip.
Sure. And I think that probably just brings up a factor, which is the more complex the travel, the more the insurance makes sense.
Yeah. And we actually haven't planned the whole trip. We need to, but the less hiccups, the better. All right. I'm moving on to number 2 here, Dan. Now I want to talk about parents. Another big thing, the vague goal we get, I ask people, is there any anticipation of maybe having to take care of your parents one day? Because that's a big ticket item that to be surprised by when you're older. And they say, well, I don't know. How could I possibly know that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting life cycle, right? You're a child and your parents, your understanding of your parents' finances is really more like sociological observation, right? Like, do we drive nice cars? Do my friends have bigger, nicer houses than I do or not? Do I have all the video game consoles or do my friends have all the video game consoles, right? Like, what kind of trips and travel and vacations are we taking? And then we become like adults and we understand like, oh, my dad's a cop and my mom's a teacher, and I can just make an educated guess about where we fall into the socioeconomic hierarchy. And then time goes on and suddenly you're in your 40s or 50s and your parents are in their 70s or 80s, and suddenly you realize, I've never had a super strong understanding of my parents' finances. I just had a general understanding of where they fit into the scheme of things. And now that worries me because I'm starting to think about my own retirement, and my financial planner is asking me about my long-term care plans and my family history and my health and so on and so forth. And I'm realizing that I don't know anything about that for my parents. And so that becomes a reason to start a conversation with your parents sooner than later, not only about just their long-term care needs, but just their broader estate plans. Hey, if you were incapacitated, a vegetable, something like that, do we have healthcare directives that we should keep you on life support or take you off? Organ donor, right? Do you want that to happen or not? Do you want to spend a lot of money on long shot treatments, or do you want to do not resuscitate sort of things? There's a lot of just healthcare conversations we had here, let alone then the financial conversation of, are you able to take care of yourself, or do I need to plan to pick up the slack for you at some point?
Well, how do you start that conversation? Nobody wants to talk about, potentially getting Alzheimer's in 5 years and what that looks like for them. That's a tough topic.
I think a little humor goes a long way, right? Like, no conversation with clients about life insurance passes without one spouse looking at the other one and being like, you're in trouble now, right? I'm going to be rich if you die. Like, no conversation ever gets by. And so I think you have to look at your parents. And there's a financial planner I know from Kansas City, George Fernandez, who has, I think, in the last 20 years, taken care of all of his and his wife's parents, like physically, no long-term care planning, no insurance, nothing like that. So they've had to become live-in parents, and they've had to caretake. And the way he puts it is, you can hem and haw about like whether you want to have this conversation or not. But here's the question I have for you, person thinking about their parents. Are you ready to see your parents naked? Are you ready to wipe their butts? Right? Are you ready to feed them? And I think for most of us, the answer to that is nope. Not just nope, like hell no. And so, the point of humor here being, right, just going to your parents and saying like, I don't want to wipe your ass, right? Or I don't want to dress you, and I never want to see you naked. So with that in mind, can we have a conversation about your retirement plan, about your overall plan, advanced care plan, so on and so forth? And it's a little awkward, it's a little uncomfortable, but getting into the nitty gritty is a lot less painful once you just start the conversation.
Right. When you're starting it early on like that, do you involve, say, all the siblings or all the, son and daughter-in-laws, or you kind of start with a smaller group and then open it up to more and more family? How does that go?
I think you start it with as small group as possible because functionally for you as an individual, you are the constituency of you, right? You are here to represent your interests in this conversation, and then your parents secondarily, and then your siblings or third parties, kind of last in the order. And so if you start the whole conversation as one big family democracy about like who lives closest to mom and dad, and who has the most free time, and who's too busy for that, and who's at a phase of life where they just got too much going on. Like, it's amazing to watch how quickly people will back up when you ask the question of like, hey, who is mom going to go live with? Right? Nobody's just going to jump forward and be like, she'll come and live with me. The default setting for almost everybody in that conversation is, I'm going to back away from the table now. Sorry, I got a lot going on. So I think it helps to just have a really direct conversation with your parent or parents about their needs, their plans, etc. And if third parties need to become involved in that, that's a later conversation, right? Like, hey, we don't have any savings. We don't have any way to provide for ourselves past a certain point. So you and your siblings are going to have to take care of us. Okay, let's have this baseline conversation first and get really clear on why you think that's the case and when you think that might happen and what might cause that to happen. And then let's bring in the relevant siblings. And I want to be careful about relevant here, because the definition of relevant is not everybody necessarily, right? I'm imagining a scenario where there's 5 siblings or something, right? It's the most kind of important or most involved siblings first. And you want to be judicious about the siblings that are maybe a little bit more selfish or a little bit more self-interested, because they are likely to throw some wrenches into this conversation in a way that's not really conducive to arriving at the end point. And the end point here is, what is our plan of care going to be for mom and dad?
How do you factor in spouses? Because maybe, say your imaginary sister is super psyched and she's like, yeah, I want mom to move in with me. I want to make sure she gets good care. I am going to feed and bathe my mother. But her husband is like, absolutely not. Total opposite ends of the spectrum.
Well, and this is where I have to sort of make a values neutral statement, because this is one where I think your personal values are going to dictate a lot more than anything I can say here. Some people come up in a family where family is everything, family first, right? And it doesn't like your spouse would be secondary to your parents, your siblings, or your whatever the case is. And some people come up in an environment and have values where they say my spouse is my person, and they are the veto here. If my spouse is not on board, I'm not on board. So you need to really just account for where you fall in that spectrum, right? I mean, I can tell you, and I'm about to say this about my own family here. My wife is a family first person. My wife would make decisions at my expense for the benefit of her siblings, of her dad, etc. I am a spouse first person. I love my parents, right? But Caitlin's needs come before my parents' needs. Now I'm in a fortunate position to be able to say that all things considered, either direction that goes is probably fine in our situation. But that's something you really do need to know before you have these conversations, right? My joke with my parents is that I have an embroidered pillow with the letters LTC, long-term care, embroidered on it, and that's the plan. If you need long-term care, I'm getting the pillow, right? That's not going to be the plan for my father-in-law, most likely, if he ever gets to a point where he needs some assistance. And I know that Caitlin would not default to sorry, he's just going to be on the street. He's got to take care of himself. That's okay. That's something we've established between ourselves. That does increase the importance of having a conversation between you and your spouse before you have a conversation about your parents or their parents.
Right. Getting in early is always key. I know when my grandma was getting older and sick, we suddenly discovered when she was 94 that nobody had like a POA and no one really knew what she wanted. It was like, how did this not come up until now? We've had plenty of time. She's 94 years old. And everyone kind of looked at each other, although she had 4 kids, and they were like, well, I don't know. What do you want to do? And it was kind of too late. She's 94.
No, I mean, I would say if you've reached the point that you're retired, and I'm speaking more to the parents in this case, if you reach the point that you're retired and you don't have a full estate plan document laid out, powers of attorney, all of that in place, you're not ready to retire. Like that is, to me, a pretty mandatory part of the retirement process is getting all that stuff in order. Because the problem is a lot of people wait until something's wrong. And something's wrong could be, I'm going to say in relative sense for this conversation, benign like cancer, which might kill you, but at least you still have all your faculties and you're not, bewildered or suffering from dementia, Alzheimer's, some sort of cognitive impairment. But a lot of the times the conversation arises when the neighbor calls and says, hey, your mom was wandering around in her nightgown in the street. Well, now we have a problem because we want to get legal stuff in place. It's kind of too late. And we're going to have to go through mechanisms like conservatorships as opposed to well-established estate documents. And it's going to increase our complexity and costs quite dramatically. So it helps to get all that stuff out in order. Because the other part, and again, I use cancer, something benign, but the other problem is if people think death is imminent, they do a lot of these conversations and a lot of this planning differently than if they think, well, they might be with us for another 3, 5, 10 years. And there's a very distinct difference in the conversations about caring for mom and dad when we think they're going to be with us and caring for mom and dad for a few weeks until they die. It's a very different conversation, and you have very different motivations in those conversations. So it's important to have those conversations well in advance of the problem.
Right. Okay. All right. Very solid advice there. Let's talk about kids then, the complete opposite end of the spectrum. How do we plan for them? You look at a child who's, maybe 5 or younger, and you're like, I have no idea what kind of person they are going to turn out to be. How can I possibly plan for my kids?
So let's assume that this conversation is happening from a place of abundance, that we're not having to balance taking care of our kids against our own needs. So you're going to be able to fund your own retirement, support your parents, whatever it is. Like you're not going to have to make material personal sacrifices. That may not be the case for everybody listening, so take this conversation with a grain of salt. But if we start this conversation from a place of abundance, I think a really good starting place is really just to think about what lessons am I going to impart through how I'm helping my kids? And conversely, what resources and things do I need to sort of think about for their personal needs when they reach a point where they need to become independent? And how are my financial decisions on their behalf going to effectuate positive outcomes in both of those areas?
Sure. Okay. So like a big topic like education, maybe talking to your spouse. Do we want to do the 529, which is specifically for education, or some other brokerage account where kid can use it for XYZ?
Yeah, I think a lot of parents hedge on this. I think we see a remarkable number of people just put money in a brokerage account or savings account rather than putting it into a college dedicated account. I think the tax advantages of 529s are pretty clear, particularly in a state like Colorado. But I can see the argument of like, look, I don't know if my kid's going to be college bound or smart or going to be the right kind of person that I want to give that kind of money to for college. So I'd prefer to retain some control. I think that's fine. I do think it behooves parents, though, to really just think about accumulating accumulating some sum of money, whether it's for college or for anything, just as sort of the sinking fund to help my kid become an adult. Because we sort of think of it as like this magical wand moment. Your kid turns 18, bam, they're an adult, and somehow magically they're going to be okay. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of us use college as our transition into adulthood. It's this nice 3-4 year experiment where we get to do things like drink and try substances and fail out of classes and have to manage our own schedules and get jobs that we maybe have our spending money from, and so on and so forth. Some of us have harder realities. We've got to pay for all of it on our own, take on a lot of debt, whatever the case is. But I think for parents who are thinking about their kids' welfare, I think the brokerage account or the 529 or both make a lot of sense. I'm actually not a huge fan of uniform transfer to minor accounts or uniform gift to minor accounts, UTMAs, UGMAs, because there's a mandatory giving to the kid at some point, where at some point they are going to get that money, whether they should have it or not. There are reasons to have those accounts. You're making gifts in incremental chunks earlier in their life where there's not going to be any gift tax complications later on. But to be frank, I'm not a big fan of them because of that forced distribution component to it. So I think in that particular sense, if you wanted to start a 529 for college, great. If you want to hedge it a little bit and do a brokerage in a 529, that's fine. If you want to hedge it completely and just do a brokerage that's in your name and maybe you'll use it to give them money later on, that's also fine. But I think burying your head in the sand is problematic.
Sure. How do you feel about giving them, an object or a thing rather than just the money? Like, buying your kid a car or a down payment on a house or something like specific?
I think this depends on the nature of the lessons you want to teach, right? So I think a lot of parents just give their kids sort of their oldest, crappiest car when their kid turns old enough to get a permit and get their license, right? Like, oh, we have a 6-year-old car and an 8-year-old car, and instead of buying you a new car, buying you a new used car, we'll just give you the 8-year-old car and I'll get myself a new or used car. I think you see a lot of that amongst parents, and that's fine to some extent. I think there's a little bit of an element where it makes sense to maybe give your kid that vehicle or let them use that vehicle on the condition of, if you break it, if you ruin it, if you destroy it, like, that's the car you got. You don't get a second car. I think, starting to transition them to things like paying for their own cell phone bill or having to pay for their own insurance, or, once they're old enough to have a part-time job, saying, like, if you want Chipotle, you get to work at Target or Starbucks or something and earn money to get to buy Chipotle. We're not just going to buy you Chipotle at random anymore. Like, just starting to impart little things about, like, you need to start balancing the fact that money for you has largely probably been about, like, buying yourself toys and fun things, and the fact that money is, for most people and in most ways, for responsible, prudent, important parts of life. And so it's just about, maybe giving certain tangibles, right? Again, like the car is a good example. I think helping your kids with a first time down payment on their first house or something like that is very generous. I think helping them with something like wedding expenses is very generous. If you have the means, I'd encourage it, because otherwise you're just sort of putting a financial burden on your kids that maybe they don't need to incur, for these life events. But you don't have to. I think this is, we're speaking from an abundance context where we have the resources to just do that. I think that's very nice of you to do. But in turn, I don't think you have an obligation to buy your kid a brand new car when they graduate college. I don't think you have an obligation to give them so much money that they didn't have to save anything for their first house and so on. I think it's okay to try to weigh the balance between helping them get a start in life and not just doing everything for them.
Right. Well, and if you plan ahead from a young enough age, for the children's young enough age, then when they get older, you have some flexibility to say, hey, I don't think they're quite as maybe mature in this one particular area, and I don't want to give them a chunk of money. Or, hey, yeah, they did turn out to be this particular way, and I am just going to give them the money that I've saved. You have the flexibility to kind of change plan.
Sure. Well, and I'll give you a good example from a client. I think the client listens to the podcast here. So if you recognize yourself, hi, it's you I'm talking about. Right. But we have clients who, when they came to us, said, like, yeah, we're essentially giving our teenage son $1,000 a month in assorted allowance. And I actually don't think that that's intrinsically bad. There's a whole different conversation about their financial plan and needs. But I think there's a family out there, there's a parent kid combo out there where at a certain age you say, like, I'm going to give you money, like more money than your allowance really warrants, but I'm going to start teaching you to be responsible for managing your expenses. Like, when we go grocery shopping, you're going to pick out some groceries for yourself and you're going to buy those, right? When we go out to dinner, you're going to spend money from that larger allowance or that enhanced allowance. And you're going to have to make a decision about whether you're getting the double bacon cheeseburger with, 2 sides and an appetizer, or whether you're just getting the salad. Like I'm gonna start teaching you financial lessons about managing your resources by giving you more resources that I would otherwise just be spending on your behalf anyway. So I think there's things like that you can do where it makes sense to give more or provide more enhancement. But I think it's really important to tie financial gifts and financial support to financial outcomes and lessons.
That's a good idea. Would you do that with your kids one day?
I will almost certainly do that with my kids. Caitlin may disagree. We'll get to that conversation at some point. But I'm not talking about doing this to like a 3-year-old, right? But I'm saying like, hey, when they get to about 10, 11, 12, and kid dependent, right? Some kids are more independent, some are more dependent, right? But when they reach a certain point where you're like, all right, this kid is smart enough to manage, $50 a week, I'm going to start placing some obligations on them to do smart things with that. Now, the one thing you want to be careful with there is some kids can figure out how to game that system pretty quickly. And you have to remember that you are the system. It's like there's some kids who will just be like, great, I will starve and I will save every dollar and I will not support myself in any way because I know you're not going to support me. Or you're not going to let me starve to death in this situation. You're not going to let me go to school in tattered rags from like 2 years ago in an undersized t-shirt. Like, understand that some kids will try to call your bluff in that sort of dynamic. And so be cautious and judicious about that and knowing your kids. But as long as everybody's sort of participating in a good faith way, I think it's a great approach.
Okay. All right. Well, I look forward to watching that pan out. Intriguing.
I hope you're here in like 20 or 30 years to judge whether my advice was working for me or not.
Yeah. I get to judge your kids and see. I'm like, yeah, that was a good idea. Yeah.
Perfect. We'll put a little time capsule reminder out like 20 years in the future to come back and see how wrong I was.
I'm sure Caitlin will be psyched.
We will find out. Anything else we want to talk about as far as setting up kids or helping kids, or are we feeling good about that?
I feel good about it. I can only critique people so much because I don't have kids. So there's kind of a point where they're like, well, until you have them, you won't actually know. So I'll quit while I'm ahead.
I mean, insert some terribly judgy comment about you're running out of time and yada yada, and kids are the best thing that ever happens to anybody.
Yeah, I get plenty of that. I'll call my mom if I want some more of that.
I will decline to substitute for your mother. All right. Well then, as we wrap up on the week, let me ask the question as always. What have you learned since you've not been on the podcast for a few weeks that you'd like to share with everybody as a good takeaway or lesson?
All right, it's big, get psyched. But you have to ask more questions, which led to my topic generation for the podcast this week. But, I'm back in school. I'm doing online classes, right? And some of my teachers do not have the communication style that I prefer, nor the quality that I am looking for in a professor. And that is teaching me to ask way more questions, be thorough, document something. But I've never regretted asking questions and getting more clarity with anybody, teachers aside, you, people in my personal life, whatever. I love asking questions, and I think everyone should do it way, way more because it always helps in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if you think about the topics we cover in the podcast here, I think we're pretty clear that knowing more is never going to hurt. Right? Have conversations with your parents, have conversations with your kids, have conversations with your spouse, your coworkers, your partners, right? Be willing to share information, right? We have a lot of sort of social mores around like not bragging, not, and keeping things certain private, so on and so forth. There's a lot of things we don't talk about as a culture that we would benefit from immensely if we really took the time to ask questions and to share our answers.
Yeah, I like it. I'm very open, for example, about what you pay me because our pay scales are public. And I know my boyfriend has made a comment. He's like, does everyone you work with know how much money you guys talk about that all the time? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Constantly.
Yep. And turns out that has not done 1 ounce of bad.
No, I love it.
Well then, ask more questions, get more answers.
There you go. There's my big wisdom.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.